of Colorado Cattlemen's Ag Water Network. I'm joined by Sarah Didrikson of CCA. She is always in the background helping things run smoothly. Today, we are going to be talking about wildfire impacts on rangeland and what recovery looks like after a wildfire. Rangeland fires can be devastating, as we all know. They can change the landscape, sometimes dramatically, but they can also spur renewal. So, what should you do after a wildfire goes through? What actions should you take? And on the other hand, when is it best to be patient and just wait for nature to work? Our presenter is Retta Bruegger. She is going to be covering these topics. And Retta is the regional specialist in range management for Colorado State University's Extension in Western Colorado. She's based out of Junction. She works with ranchers, land managers on in Western Colorado. So we were also going to be joined after Retta's presentation by Aaron Spar, executive. Welcome. Go ahead and put that in the chat, or you can save it and just ask it after Retta's presentation is concluded. Also, we are going to be recording or are recording today's webinar, and we'll put a link to that on our website later on. We will also post highlights of the webinar, which will summarize the main points that Retta makes. So, Retta, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here today, and a great group of folks I can see are on the webinar. So like Phil said, I'm going to be really talking about recovering from rangeland fire from a plant perspective. So it's a plant and an ecosystem perspective. I'm really going to be focusing on the western slope of Colorado because that's my expertise, as well as that's where we had many large fires this year. And I'm not going to be talking about some of the big impacts of fire that all of us, that we experience that can be really devastating to communities, to individuals, to infrastructure, et cetera. I'm going to be focusing more on ecosystem processes and plants and how they respond to fire. When do we need to intervene, and how do we go about judging when it's appropriate for us to get engaged as land managers, when our intervention is really needed, is the essence of what I'll be talking about. So to jump right in, when Phil came to me with this idea, he presented fire. First part of the presentation here, I'll talk about how wildfire affects rangeland plant communities. Are there any benefits? What can we expect in the coming years? And then I'll shift into the what do we do about it part of the presentation, where I'll be focusing much more on what types, should we intervene? When should we intervene? How do we know that? So that if you're a land manager or somebody who's experienced wildfire, maybe it will give you some guideposts about when action's important and necessary. And when it's not as well. So to jump right in, first part, I'm going to be talking about how does wildfire affect rangeland plant communities? What should we expect to see in the coming years? And are there any upsides to wildfire? And again, here I'm really talking about from a plant and ecosystem perspective. I'm not talking about people and communities. I'm really focused on that plant perspective today. Most of the time, I think we are talking about communities, infrastructure, all of that, and that's extremely important. But today actually will just exclusively be on that plant side of it. So we know from a lot of lines of research that fire is part of plant communities, and many of the plant communities that we have here on the Western Slope evolved with some level of fire. We know too that certain ecosystems need fire. So they need fire to regenerate themselves. Species might be dependent on fire for reproduction and growth. And fire can sort of reset communities, consume woody fuels, and allow for maybe diverse and new ecosystem types. Well, not evolutionarily new, but ecosystem types that haven't been seen in a while to regrow and show themselves on the landscape. So fire can have quite a few benefits. It can really be a part of the cycle of many of our plant communities. Now, that said, because we have such large variation here on the Western Slope. So I know I can see the participant list. I know many of you are on the Western Slope. And if you're here, you really know that we're managing areas of land that are like from 4,500 feet in elevation all the way up to probably not 14,000 feet, but really high elevation areas and everything in between. And so within that, there's huge variation in terms of how fire really participated in plant communities. And different plant communities do have a different relationship with fire. What that means is that historically, fire might have occurred more frequently or less frequently. There's some types of plants, vegetation types like lodgepole pine, where we might expect a fire to occur to replace the entire stand and then the whole stand regenerate at the same time. Other types have different relationships with fire, like ponderosa pine can really evolve to where there's bigger trees, fire might be required to release seed, but where we might have low intensity fires coming through that ecosystem. We don't have a ton of like large scale ponderosa pine on the Western Slope. So some of the ecosystems we do have, aspen is one example. Aspen's it's not a rangeland, right? It's a forest. I acknowledge that. But these are ecosystems that are grazed. And they require some kind of disturbance to regenerate themselves. Fire can be that type of disturbance, even though aspen are resistant to fire. They need some form of disturbance, whether that's fire, avalanche, etc., in order to reset and regrow over time. So take homes here is that many of our ecosystems evolved with fire, but that exact relationship is going to be really different depending on what specific plant community you're talking about. And then this influences, I think, decisions that can be made in the management sphere about what do we do after fire. So we'll get to that through some examples as we continue with the presentation. I think it's important to keep in mind with that is that because fire had really different relationships with different plant communities historically, recovery times can also vary a lot depending on the ecosystem type that we're talking about in Western Colorado. So for some areas that were burned this summer or in past years, recovery might be fairly quickly, maybe 3 to 5 years. Other ecosystem types, it's going to take a really long time, maybe decades or even longer, until that ecosystem maybe grows back to where it was before the fire. Other ecosystems may not recover in that linear trajectory, we would call it. They might become something entirely different than what they were pre-fire. So there's some uncertainty here about what's going to happen, and there are differences between ecosystems. And then finally, I think it's important to mention that plant communities throughout Colorado and on the Western Slope have been impacted by two factors. One is fire suppression. So we do have a legacy of fire suppression on the landscape, which probably contributed to putting out smaller fires and contributed to potentially some of the bigger fires that we've seen today. But then we also have this other trend, which is aridification. So hotter and drier temperatures tend to favor some of the shrub species, sagebrush, rabbitbrush, other species on the Western Slope. And we've seen an increase in those woody species in the past 40 years. So we've got some different trends occurring. I think the main thing to remember is that when we're thinking about post-fire management, it's really going to depend on that plant community and how fire interacted with that plant community historically. But there are benefits. Fire is a natural process and plants can benefit from it. Some plants even need fire in order to regenerate, either on an individual level or on an ecosystem level. So this leads us to kind of the heart of the matter. So post-fire, should we intervene? Is intervening necessary? So Phil kind of phrased these questions as what differences can you expect to see if you recede versus letting nature take its course? And is there a way to tell? Is it worthwhile to intervene, like in the form of seeding or some other management action, rather than just waiting and letting nature take its course? So these are some questions that people might have after the fire year that we just experienced here. So when we're thinking about these questions, I think it's really important to remember our role in these big ecosystems or rangelands that we operate in on the Western Slope. So these are large landscapes, and we don't hold all the cards. Professor at CSU, Mark Paschke, calls it ecological humility. We need to remember that we're not in control of some of the dominant processes that influence what we see on these landscapes. So just because we intervene, it does not mean that we're going to be successful at that, and that it also may not always be necessary. So when we're thinking about should I intervene or not, a couple things to keep in mind. Intervening, seeding, there are times when it's really necessary, and we'll talk about that, but it's expensive. We also know the biggest predictor of seeding success from a lot of different literature, but specifically a big study that was done several years ago where they looked at, I think, like over 100,000 seeding treatments that had been done historically. The biggest predictor of seeding success is weather. We're not in control of weather. So if you're going to take a management action like that on a rangeland, it's really important to think about
Rangeland.
how do you increase the chances of seeding success in that particular area. And then finally, sometimes the seeding actions we undertake can have unintended consequences. We'll talk more about this as well, but there's a couple examples historically when we've seeded species, they have been successful, but they might not always help us achieve goals that change as management changes through the decades. So we're now going to go into, like, if we're not always in control of the environment we work in rangelands, I think what's very important to do is to have some kind of strategy or framework for thinking about when is seeding or other interventions, when are they critical? So for me, this comes from Ali Urza, who's a researcher with USDA. I believe it's the Rocky Mountain Research Lab. She is out of California, but she's a real expert in this field. And talking to her, I think it really boils down to when we're thinking about intervening post-fire, it's important to think about what areas need help. So what areas would benefit from our intervention? And then can that area actually respond to the intervention? So we're going to unpack this, but these are the two things that I think it boils down to. Do areas need our help? Do we have reason to believe they would benefit from something we could do? And then based on those site conditions, can they respond to that intervention? So we'll first start with really unpacking what does needing help look like from an ecosystem perspective? What does this actually mean? I think we could talk about this from a couple of different perspectives. If seeding is worth it, I think depends on several different factors. So these, in my mind, boil down to the ecosystem history with fire, so the role that fire played in the plant community historically. You may not know this, but there are people who do. You can always reach out to me. Many folks who work at agencies also know this, or can look up that information. But certain plants are less good at recovering post-fire. Sagebrush is actually one of them. It doesn't do that well. But plants do really well. So we want to understand what that historical role of fire that fire. I think understanding something about pre-fire is also important. Was there a lot of bare ground? Were there a lot of invasive species like cheatgrass? Because that influences what might be in the soil. There's a mountain meadow. There's a lot of different species in this photo. There's high grass diversity. There's high grass cover. There's high forb cover. As long as the fire intensity and severity wasn't too high, which we'll get to in a second. But really thinking about that pre-fire condition, what was there before? If there was a lot of bare ground before the fire, there might not be that seed source to regenerate the community. A big factor I also think about is site characteristics when I'm thinking about does area help? By I think biggest that easy to hear is elevation. Elevated site they tend floor here in Grand drier sites. It's going to be more challenging for that ecosystem to regenerate on its own, but higher elevation areas will probably be okay without our intervention, depending on what it looked like pre-fire. Another factor to consider here is fire severity. How hot did that fire get? Because this influences that soil seed bank. If a fire got so hot that it burned, the top layers of soil, combusted some of that organic matter, it might have also combusted some of the seeds that were there. And so that might influence the availability of seed, again, to regenerate the ecosystem. And then finally, we also might consider some post-fire conditions. The past couple months, for better or for worse, because of the massive flooding we've seen on the leaf fire, which is definitely challenging. But with some of that moisture, there's been the potential for species to regrow. So I've toured the leaf fire as well as the South Rim fire on the Black Canyon and the Gunnison. And both those fires, not to diminish the massive impact of flooding in the leaf fire, but there are areas where grasses are already resprouting. And some of those grasses are not cheatgrass, they're actually cool season grasses. So, if post-fire conditions are favorable, we have a higher chance of, restoring to a state that might be just desirable, even perhaps without intervention. So if we're thinking about if seeding is necessary, these are some things you might want to consider. So let's roll through some examples here, and I'll show you to some degree how I think about ecosystems when I'm trying to evaluate if an intervention is necessary. So what about this site? If you are just listening and not looking at the pictures, this is a picture of an area of sagebrush. There's a good mixture of grass. The sagebrush is not too dense, meaning it's kind of spaced out. There's not just only sagebrush and nothing else. There's definitely sagebrush and then other desirable native grasses mixed in there. So if this is what a site looked like pre-fire, I personally would think that it has a good chance of having seeds, again, as long as the fire intensity wasn't too high, fire intensity and severity wasn't too high, there's a good chance that there's sufficient seed in the soil where a seeding intervention might not be necessary because that seed is already there from the pre-existing plant community. So that might be how I would apply that information to this scenario. Now, let's say this area looks like here, what we see in the picture post-fire. And so for folks on the phone, we're looking at a burned rangeland. This is a fire that occurred in Moffat County in 2018, which was a really severe drought year. And it looks pretty bad. It's denuded of all vegetation. But one thing that I do see in this picture is that there's some litter on the surface, or what ecologists would call litter, which is kind of parts of plants that are no longer attached to a growing plant. So what we see here is little bits of wood, probably from sagebrush. There's also some leaves here, like little teeny leaves on the soil surface that weren't combusted. So what this might indicate is that the fire might not have been as intense and severe enough that it burned through seeds that are in the soil surface, and there might still be that seed bank to grow if conditions are favorable. Another thing here that I would be looking for if I was out in the field looking at a fire like this is, do I see any of the crowns of bunch grasses? Sometimes they can be burned up, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're dead. So there's a chance that some of them will resprout given favorable conditions, like I have seen on fires this summer. And that again, seeding might not be necessary, even though it looks really bad right now. And admittedly, it does look really bad. Now, I happen to have worked on some of these fires in Moffat County from about 2013 to 2016. We were doing a study where we were looking at areas that had been burned in wildfire, and then some areas had been seeded post-wildfire, other areas had not been seeded post-wildfire, and then areas that had not been burned. So we were trying to get an understanding of how does wildfire participate in these ecosystems specifically, and what is the relative value of some of the interventions. Now, this is a different fire in Moffat County. This one burned, I think, in about 2010 to potentially 2011. Not exactly sure. We sampled it in 2013 and 2014. And what you can see here from a cattle perspective mainly is that there's quite a bit of forage on the landscape. And in fact, we found in areas that had been burned, there was a lot more forage, which you would expect because the competition from woody species like sagebrush has been removed. The grasses are really taking advantage of that situation, are able to grow quickly, and we saw a lot of forage. Interestingly, many of these grasses are native grasses, and we saw lower amounts of cheatgrass in areas that had been burned compared to areas that were not burned. So that was kind of an interesting finding that contrasts what we're seeing in like the Great Basin in Nevada and Idaho, et cetera. But at least, in Moffat County during this period, the fires were kind of, causing that reset of the ecosystem. We also found that several years out, areas that had been seeded looked very similar to areas that had not been seeded. So seeding might be an intervention that could be desirable. You could think about like what that post-fire condition looks like. But in some of these sites, it didn't appear to cause a significant difference over not doing anything post-fire. So things I would be looking for in this situation, again, what was pre-fire condition? What did pre-fire condition look like? Was how intense and severe were the fires? And then what were post-fire conditions like? So is there sufficient moisture? And those might give me a sense of like, is intervention really needed on some of these landscapes? So what about this site here? This is a picture of kind of what I would call a greasewood flat. Greasewood is a shrub species native to Colorado and the Western US. It tends to grow in areas that have higher salts and may also be extremely clayey. So what we're looking at here is a greasewood plant and then a whole bunch of cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is typically an undesirable annual grass. It can have a role, but it's a non-native grass that can be an important contributor to an undesirable fire return interval, we call it. So it can cause a lot of fire to occur on the landscape, which disfavors shrubs and other ecosystem features. So this is an area where, if we go through kind of our mental list, the seed bank from the pre-existing species pre-fire is probably dominated by cheatgrass, right? We don't have a whole lot of desirable grasses out in this field. So this is an area where I think our help intervening would be more necessary, more important, because on its own, the ecosystem does not have those key cool season bunch grasses or cool season grasses that contribute to the forage potential and other ecosystem benefits that we see here. So this is an area where I would be like, if I'm going through my two questions, does an area need help and can it respond to help? This one is checking that box of this area really could use some intervention. So that gets us to our next question. So we talked a little bit about like what constitutes needing help when we're talking about ecosystems. I think there's some factors we can evaluate, like pre-fire condition, fire severity and intensity, where the site is located on the landscape, to help guide those questions of if an ecosystem is likely to recover on its own or if it needs some kind of intervention. The next piece that we really need to be thinking about, because of costs and issues with our ability to intervene successfully, are, can this ecosystem actually respond to any intervention I might do? So let's unpack that a little bit. We know, again, from really large studies and other experience, that seeding success can be very low and very risky, especially in the most arid sites. There is a place for seeding, and it can be a really important part of restoration, but there's risk involved, and we should be aware of that when we're thinking about intervening with seeding. So just as an example, this picture is an area that I've toured. There's a lot of wild horse grazing on it. You can see there's not a whole lot of desirable vegetation growing in this particular area. This is an area, in my mind, that probably wouldn't burn because there's not enough fuel, but it's an area that really could use some intervention. However, it's going to be really hard for seeding alone to be successful in this type of environment. So we want to really be thinking about not only does it need help, but can it respond? So let's continue thinking about that. What about this area here? If you're not looking at the screen, this is a picture again of a sagebrush field. There's a lot of cheatgrass. The sagebrush isn't too dense, so it's not like only sagebrush, but the sagebrush is fairly spaced out, but there's quite a bit of cheatgrass underneath the sagebrush. So this is an area, if we're thinking about the need help, possibly because probably the dominant seed bank or the dominant species in the seed bank is going to be cheatgrass. Um, and then if we want to think about can it respond to help? If I was in charge, I'd be thinking about, what elevation are we at? It might lack the seed bank to recover, but how effective is the seeding treatment going to be? If we're talking about sites that are less arid than Grand Junction, I happen to know this is around 6,500 or 7,000 feet in elevation. I think there's a pretty good chance that seeding could be successful here. So maybe this is an area that checks both those boxes, needs help and can respond. How about our lovely picture here of greasewood and cheatgrass? This is an area, again, I think it really checks that needs help box, but I think this is going to be an area it's going to be challenging to restore because it's probably had some constraints from an ecosystem perspective. It's probably a little more arid, drier, clayer soils, might have some salt issues, etc. So if we're going to think about intervening here, we want to be strategic in that, but certainly checks the needs help box for me. And then we would want to think about how can we intervene in a way that it can respond most effectively? We'll talk more about that. What about this ecosystem type here? So this is a picture of pinyon juniper in southwestern Colorado, and there's quite a diversity within the pinyon juniper ecosystem type. But for the purposes of today, some of the fires that burned this year did impact pinyon or areas dominated by pinyon and juniper. And sometimes this ecosystem type, we can get a really strong buildup of pinyon and juniper and a decrease in the grass understory underneath those trees. So when a fire comes through, there's a couple of different trajectories that could happen. We could see high risk for cheatgrass invasion because there was a lot of bare ground pre-fire, or potentially could, let's say the seeds are there, it could release an herbaceous response that might be more desirable. So this is an area where maybe I do a little more research, think about the elevation, the site, maybe think about specific sites within an ecosystem that looks like this where seeding might be most effective. But if we're really worried about cheatgrass, I think this would be an area that might need help. And then we'd want to think about, again, how do we be strategic in an area so that we increase the chances that it can respond to help in an effective way. And then finally, ending on Gamble Oak here. This is an area or a land type. A lot of Gamble Oak, unfortunately, burned this year. Gamble Oak is a really big management challenge. I think many people would love to see areas that were Gamble Oak go in a different direction after the fire, but unfortunately, Gamble Oak is really good at resprouting after fire. It loves fire, and it's probably some people on the call have seen this, but it can send up like hundreds of little shoots after it's either been cut or burned. So this is an area where, yes, maybe it need help. We would like to see it move in a different direction, but I think it's going to be really challenging from a management perspective to be effective with Gamble Oak. There are some examples on the Western Slope of people who are doing some innovative things, but it's a challenging environment to work in for sure. So if we are thinking about, an area that was impacted by wildfire, and we think we have sort of thought about, yes, an area does need help, we think it can respond to help. What are some of the best practices for doing an intervention? So I'm going to summarize some research that I've participated in, but also comes from those large synthesis studies that I referenced earlier. But in order to improve chances of seeding success post-fire, one of the biggest recommendations that's coming out is to increase the seeding rate relative to industry standard. Now, I was talking to Ali Urza, who again is a researcher in California with the USDA, and she's done some research where she's applied different seeding rates in a post-fire situation. And at this point, what she can say is that above industry standard is better, but we don't yet have like an exact number that we could give people about like how much above industry standard. But higher seeding rates generally contributes more to seeding success. Now, along those lines, seed is expensive, and you can't, if you're going to do more, then you're probably going to hit your budget threshold sooner than if you do less over a larger area. So another recommendation from Allie and from research that I've participated in is to focus, instead of doing like everywhere across an area that has been burned, to focus in or put more effort into smaller areas. So this might be prioritizing areas that, again, need help and can respond to help with a higher seeding intensity. In ecology, we call this a restoration island concept. So really like putting more effort into smaller areas to increase the chance that the restoration effort will be successful. Now we're doing this as part of a project that I participate again. It's called RestoreNet. We have test plots in southwestern Colorado, and these aren't post-wildfire plots, but they're plots that are highly degraded, where managers really want to increase the amount of forage available for grazing livestock as well as other species. And this is really, we're seeing this to be true in our work as well. When we put more effort in, it's more expensive, more limited area in terms of the physical extent, but that we increase the chance that it will be successful in that limited area and potentially be a seed source to revegetate that broader area. We also know, I talked earlier about the biggest factor influencing seeding success is weather. We all know we're not in control of the weather. So in order to hedge our bets and give seeds the highest potential for success, timing of seeding is really important. And yes, we don't control weather, but I think the research as well as the dominant practice here on the Western Slope is that people opt for fall or winter seedings. And this is because often we do get snow, we do get winter moisture, even if it's a drought. And so when the soil warms up sufficiently in the spring, there is some moisture for those plants to germinate. So that's kind of the dominant recommendation there is opt for a fall or winter seeding. A big question in this space is, are we going with native or non-native species? So there's some different schools of thought on this, and there's some different benefits and trade-offs on this. As Allie said, smart, competent people have very different opinions on this issue than I do. So I think this is an area where people are just going to disagree because the world is complex and there's not just one answer. But one thing that I have seen and others have seen is as well is that some of these non-native species that are easier to establish. So crested wheatgrass, intermediate wheatgrass, it's going to establish more easily compared to a native species. But there's a big trade-off there, and that is that it can be really a lifetime commitment. If you don't want that species 50 years hence in that spot, it's probably best not to seed it today. Now, those species, again, they can have really good implications, especially areas where you might be at high risk for cheatgrass. Those are species that can compete with cheatgrass. But if you're looking for your end goal to be kind of like a native species mix, or you want to have some diverse forages in there or whatever, it's probably best to minimize the amount of non-native grasses in your seed mix or eliminate them altogether. So as an example of this is again Moffat County, talking about Moffat County a lot today, but did a lot of work there, and there have been several fires. But this is an area where we sampled. This again was back in 2013, 2014. This is an area that was planted with crested wheatgrass in the 1950s. It burned in the 2010s. It was reseeded with native species following the wildfire. And when we seeded or sampled it, it was almost entirely crested wheatgrass. There was very few species out there. It was dominant crested wheatgrass. And there's really strong research on this. If you already have crested wheatgrass, then it's very challenging to introduce other species into that mix if crested wheatgrass already dominates. So, not saying it's bad, it certainly has a place, especially for those hard to restore situations. You might be dealing with an even worse invader like cheatgrass. So it has a place, but just know what you're getting into. It can be very persistent and very hard to reintroduce diversity if that might be your long-term goal. One of the biggest questions I get along those lines is, what species should I seed with then? And a couple resources on this. Of course, as I just talked about, it depends on your goal and the situation. A lot of seed companies do have a post-fire restoration mix. And then there's a couple of tools. If you are interested in seeding and you have a mix, you're welcome to contact me and I could talk through it with you relative to your environment. This is also a tool I'm showing here on the screen. It's called the Colorado Seed Tool. It was developed by Danielle Johnson and Danielle Newman at Colorado Plant Parks and Wildlife. And basically, it would allow you to enter a seed mix and you can enter stuff about your site and it can tell you how appropriate or not appropriate that species mix is. And you can also create a seed mix. So that might be a tool in the toolbox for people who really want to get nerdy or in depth about the seed mix that they're applying to land. But this is a question that you're always welcome again to reach out. NRCS has great information, BLM, Forest Service, all those entities have information on the seed mixes that they use and information on plants. Wrapping up towards the end of my presentation here, there's some other interventions I do want to mention. Seeding is often a strategy that people go to, but there's other interventions that might also be important. So if we're talking about weed control, as your dominant threat, and let's say you're in an area like that greasewood picture I showed, that's going to be challenging for seeds to establish in, your best bet might actually be doing some kind of weed control practice, maybe instead or in addition to a seeding treatment. And then if we're talking about erosion control, this is a whole other discussion, but if we're talking about erosion control, seeding tends to not be as effective for that because it takes about 1 to 3 years for seeding to establish if the seeding does work. And in that time, you have a lot of opportunity for flooding. So mulching can be much more effective for erosion control. It also can be really effective as a practice to do in conjunction with seeding to retain soil moisture. So recapping here as I wrap up, if you experience wildfire or are just curious, when we're thinking about intervening post-wildfire, I think it really boils down to thinking about, does the area need help and can it respond to the help that I give? Wildfire participates differently in the many different types of rangelands that we have in Colorado and on the Western Slope, but some clues that we might consider are the pre-fire condition, the site characteristics, the fire severity, and the post-fire conditions. Some ecosystems are going to be they can respond much faster to wildfire compared to others, so that's important to keep in mind. We need to remember, have a sense of ecological humility. Action is not always needed. We're not in control always. Well, in a lot of ways, we're not in control of what these ecosystems do. So we need to leverage the control we do have strategically. And I think that really means those questions of, does it need help? Can help be effective? There's no one size fits all. It depends on your goals. You can increase your chances of success by seeding at higher than industry recommended rates, timing for dormant season seedings, and really putting more effort into smaller areas versus diluting that effort over bigger areas of land. And then remember, seeding is not the only tool in the toolbox. Mulch, treating invasives, those are also really important actions in a post-fire scenario. So with that, if anyone's interested, there's a whole bunch of other resources on this topic. There's a great fact sheet from the NRCS. There's plant-specific fact sheets from the Colorado State Forest Service. And then there's some fact sheets, again, from the Colorado State Forest Service on soil erosion after wildfire. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening today, and thank you specifically to Dr. Ali Urza, for her help preparing this presentation. And with that, I can take some questions if there's time, and if not, we can move on to Aaron.
So Retta, while we're waiting for questions, I have one. I thought that restoration island concept was fascinating, and it just makes so much sense. So how do you decide where those restoration islands should be?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think I forgot to mention this. I think that leveraging the inherent qualities in the landscape is the best bet there. So, does it need help and can it respond to help? So maybe we're thinking about like north-facing slopes. Maybe we're thinking about swales where there might be a little more moisture accumulation. Maybe we're thinking about little microclimates on the landscape where that might be a little bit more wet. I say that because it tends to be that dryness is the most limiting factor for seeding success. in Western Colorado and other arid environments. So just leveraging any area that's just a little bit wetter can be a good guidepost for how do you place a restoration island on the landscape.
So you might be looking at a restoration island where you're going to not, I don't know, overseed, maybe that's not the term, but increase the seeding rate over what, you might have otherwise if you were just doing it on a larger scale. And then would you mulch that too? And then what type of mulch would you use?
Yeah, well, so mulching tends to, yeah. So in the restoration trials that I mentioned, and they're not post-fire restoration trials, but they're just seeding establishment trials. Mulching is a soil moisture conservation strategy, if you think about it. So it's helping to keep that ground underneath a little more wet. And so it can be really effective to do in conjunction with seeding. We've looked at some different options there. So one of our projects, we work with the Mountain Ute tribe, and they've done a bunch of tamarisk removal. So we use tamarisk mulch, which potentially is scary because it could introduce seed, but we actually found for whatever reason the tamarisk mulch performed well. There was some seeding recruitment underneath that mulch. Not everyone has access to the type of mulch, so probably the main goal there is just like free of undesirable seeds and available. But mulch can be a really good strategy. It's also a good strategy for erosion control. And like I mentioned, it tends to beat seeding when it comes to erosion control.
So I want to jump over to cheatgrass for a minute. And we know cheatgrass normally loves fire, although it sounds like there are maybe exceptions to that thought. But normally cheatgrass comes in strong after fire.
Mhm.
And if you have like you showed that Greasewood Flats photo, where you have greasewood plant and then you have this just vast field, what looks like of just almost pure cheatgrass. So we don't know how long that's been there, probably a while, and it's certainly been dominating it for a while. So I mean, can you assume that there is still a diverse seed bank of desirable species underneath that? And could you go in there and hit that with like a chemical like Rejuva or something like that? Or are you better off just trying one of these, for example, restoration islands in a scenario like that?
Yeah, I think, well, so every scenario is different, and there are a lot of experts on the call. So I wonder if people's like wheels are turning as we're talking. But that's a scenario where, I would assume that the site I showed, cheatgrass, greasewood, those tend to be like very hard to restore sites for a lot of reasons, but also because they're arid, low elevation. So personally, I would be looking at like how can we control the cheatgrass? Um, and there's some trade-offs there. If you did use a indaziflam or Rejuva, that's something where you really don't want to seed with indaziflam because it's a pre-emergent. It's going to kill any seed that you seed in addition to the cheatgrass seed. Um, so I guess, if Rejuva is also extremely expensive, but I would be looking at like how can we control that weed species? You could also, I've known people who've harvested soil from a site and then like grew it up in their house to see if there's any desirable plants in that soil seed bank. Um, so that would be a strategy. I've never done that personally, but I know people who have done that. So that would be a strategy just to see if there's existing seeds there. But then I think it would be a discussion about like how can we apply a chemical or do some kind of intervention to control the cheatgrass for long enough that we could come back in later and then reseed it. Or actually, one thing that we also experiment with, which is very intensive, is that we plant seedlings that we grew up in a lab out in the field, and there is much higher chances of success with that. But most people are never going to do that because of how intensive it is. But I think there's barriers for a seed to become a plant that can be overcome if you could just get that live desirable plant out on the landscape. So long answer, but yeah, my priority there would probably be controlling the weeds.
Okay, so jumping over to some of the impacts from the lead fire. I mean, there was a lot of that was very juniper dominated,
Mhm.
that area that burned. And the areas that I've seen, before the fire went through, some of those areas hardly had any grass at all
Mhm.
between the juniper trees. And there might have been some pinions up higher, but so I mean, what is you've seen at least parts of that fire since it went through. What's your interpretation of what that seed bank generally looks like? in those areas where it's really been, just there's been some long-term degradation to the landscape, and it's just pretty much only, just junipers.
Yeah, I think those would be like high priority areas for seeding. If they really, I mean, again, you could take some of the soil and grow it out inside in a greenhouse or whatever and see if anything comes up. But and there has been some work on soil seed banks that sometimes is more surprising than you think. But in general, if it's just a bunch of bare ground and a pinyon or juniper overstory, I'd really consider that as a priority area for seeding. And then you also might consider there's some work on like what is surrounding that area. Like, is there a big seed source of cheatgrass right next door? And if so, even more important to focus in on what you could do to prevent that from happening across the landscape. Um, yeah, so I think those would be high priority areas. But again, I think there's always the tendency of like, we'll put a little bit of seed everywhere. And sometimes that can be very ineffective because there's not enough to get like a beneficial response anywhere. So I would be looking for opportunities to focus in on areas that had pre-existing bare ground and a really high canopy, maybe lower elevate, well, mid elevation sites, and then might have the potential to respond. So swales, north facing slopes, any area where maybe it's capturing a little more moisture.
Okay.
Should I
I don't know
look
if you can see
in?
Harmony's
Oh,
question. She is
I can.
asking about peat, and if you have a fire, I presume this is up at a higher elevation where you've got a
Mhm.
significant amount of peat around, and it burns that peat up. What would your conclusion be regarding the viability of that? Is there a seed bank left? Has it mostly been burned?
Yeah, so well, of course, like I would always want to know more about the situation, but I think, yeah, if the peat layer burned below the surface soil, that might be an indicator that there is not, no longer the seed bank is there. So I think that could be a really good indicator. Um, I think one thing that I also see in fires is that sometimes there's patchiness in the way they burn. So there can be like an area that was burned very intensely next to an area that was burned less intensely. So you could also think about that spatially, like how the BLM does produce fire or soil burn severity maps. So that's probably a resource that you could look at as well, where they map out the impact of the fire on the soil. But yeah, I think those are good ways to think about it. And I would say, yeah, if you're seeing that it was burned through the soil surface, then it's potential that they burned the seeds as well.
Okay, so we're going to close up the questions for now, but I'm sure Retta would have no problem with you emailing her with your questions if you think of some later. Retta, you might want to just put your email address in the chat if you have a chance, and or give her a call. But Retta is just such a wealth of knowledge, and I really appreciate this. We're going to switch over now to Aaron Spar. Aaron is the Executive Vice President of Colorado Cattlemen's, and the Aaron, the impacts of wildfire are different for every livestock producer, but it often includes a lot of destruction, a lot of damage, livestock mortalities, lost grazing lands, debris, flows and ditches and culverts and across pastures that have to be cleaned up. So it winds up being a lot of heartbreak and unforeseen costs that producers have to try to absorb. If there's some funding available that could help alleviate that or reduce that burden, that would be great. Do you know of some that is available now?
Yeah, thanks, Phil, for that question. And I think that is exactly what I wanted to cover as we've seen um, devastating impacts of fires from the Lee Fire in the Meeker area down to the Turner Gulch to the Retta mentioned the South Rim Fire in the Black Mesa or Black Canyon area. And I just wanted to cover kind of the funding availability for those programs and then also what resources CCA has available for those impacted producers. Looking at the attendee list, I know there's a number of producers, but also a number of resources or people with resources available that know far more than I am probably going to have time to elaborate on. And so I would just start out with saying contact your local NRCS and FSA office, as there's a number of resources available for those impacted from fire. However, with the current timing of the government shutdown, it's not great timing. And so I know some of those employees are currently deemed as essential, and so they are working to get funding on the ground, but some of those are furloughed for the time being. And so we're trying to work through all of those. I just plan to go through funding availability and kind of give an overview of what's available from in our FSA, NRCS, and then some other funding programs, and then the disaster relief fund jointly between organizations. With FSA, the Farm Service Agency, they have a number of programs. The Livestock Indemnity Program, which covers actual livestock loss, the Emergency Conservation Program, Livestock Forage Program, Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, and then NAP. And I would say I will make sure there's a disaster assistance brochure or flyer from the USDA to make sure to that's included. And then with the follow-up from this webinar. And then from NRCS, they have, of course, EQIP if you've been a part of that. And then from a broader perspective, they have the Emergency Watershed Program, which is focused on recovery. And I do know that in the Meeker area, the Conservation District and the county are involved in the Emergency Watershed Program recovery. I believe I saw a Conservation District representative on, and so if there's follow-up after that, we can make sure to get questions answered. I think there's a number of programs. I wish it was a little more streamlined, but there's parts and pieces that you can find in FSA or NRCS. From a state funding perspective, there is the Carl Parks and Wildlife Habitat Partnership Program that could potentially help with reseeding, as Retta was talking about it, replacement of water systems that were potentially burnt up, and also key fencing as long as they're replaced in a wildlife-friendly manner, and then also potentially some virtual fencing opportunities. And then an opportunity from the Colorado Department of Ag, which is a state funding opportunity focused on fire, flood, drought, or blizzards, is their Climate Resilience Fund. It's currently opened and that application closes on November 24th. And so I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. The max funding request is $30,000, but I wanted to make sure everyone's aware of that opportunity, especially those impacted by fire or potentially flooding from the fire impacts, as that is an opportunity that will be closing soon. That kind of gives the perspective of what, and of course, if you have Forest Service or BLM leases, there could be some resources from that perspective. And that gives a perspective from the federal and state funding opportunities. I also wanted to give you another opportunity where the Carl Cattlemen's Association, Carl Livestock Association, and Colorado Farm Bureau came together for a disaster relief fund. This was initially activated during the 2007 blizzard, and we've continued to activate it as we've seen natural disasters in Colorado. We have currently activated it for fires. All fires are eligible, and this is to aid farmers and ranchers in any loss in ag. And we, in order to make sure that we're not double funding or double dipping, we are waiting till FSA and NRCS have dispersed funds. And then if there's any holes that or anything producers need from fencing or any hay or anything like that, you can apply through this disaster relief fund and get those funds dispersed to you. And so I wanted to make everyone aware of that opportunity. We are in kind of limbo as we wait for FSA and NRCS to get those funds on the ground and applications in, and then we can make sure that everyone is aware of this joint fund by the ag organizations. So Phil, that is what I had, and I'll make sure that if anyone has any questions, please reach out to CCA. I'll also send around the USDA disaster assistance flyer to make sure everyone and then like I said, make sure if you have questions or have any needed resources to make sure to reach out to CCA and we can connect you, or to reach out to your local FSA, NRCS Conservation District, and they have these resources available as well.
Is there information on like CCA's website, Aaron, on that disaster relief, the association's funding?
We will be putting it up as we get it finalized between the three organizations. And this has also, if you're a CCA member, it has gone out in our weekly e-news. But as we finalize the information and the form, we'll make sure that it's posted on CCA's website.
Okay. And you said the Department of Ag's that's Colorado Department of Ag's, their climate resilience grant program. The deadline is November 24th. So got a little over a month to get an application together. And by the way, if somebody is needing help with that and they're interested in pursuing that, let us know. We would be glad to help prepare that grant application if you need help in that way. Let's see, anything else, Aaron?
No, I just want to say, I think Retta did a great job of kind of looking at the benefits if you're currently impacted, of just thinking of long-term recovery from a wildfire, but I think also thinking about all the devastating impacts that happen to infrastructure and all of that. And we want to make sure that you have the resources available and the information needed to know what resources are available to you. And so I think marrying those together, I know there's immediate impacts now, but also thinking through the long term of what is best for that post-fire recovery.
Yeah, and speaking of that post-fire recovery, I just wanted to give an additional shout out. Retta mentioned the Colorado Seed Tool, which was developed by Parks and Wildlife. And I have used that tool, and it is really a cool little app that you can load on your phone, your computer. And you can create seed mixes. You tell them where you are and what you're interested in doing, or you can get an opinion on the seed mix that you're thinking of. So it's just a really cool app, Colorado Seed Tool. Just Google that, and it should come up. Retta, did you have any closing thoughts?
You
Just
know,
want to
just no. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. And yeah, reach out. I know that there's some experts on the call, so it's great to see the group that came out today, and looking forward to working with anyone in the future.
And then one final thing, we did record this, so we'll be posting that, a link to this recording of the webinar on the website, agwaternetwork.org. And I will also prepare a highlights document, which will summarize Retta's main points, as well as the points Aaron made regarding funding availability. So with that, we really appreciate you joining us today. And if you have any comments or questions or anything, any complaints, you can send those to Aaron. But anything else, especially if it's accolades, send those to me at phil@brinkinc.biz. And again, we thank you for joining us today and hope you have a great afternoon. This concludes today's webinar.